The key thing about social media is they would have gone after the Hearst just nonstop. It would have been, and Patty herself, I think they would have just vilified her. It is pretty much of an unprecedented case. There's never really been anything like it. I think the reader needs to decide in their own mind what a historian or a journalist does is who do I want to believe? There were 10 members of the Simeonese Liberation Army. All of them were white except their leader, Donald DeFreeze Q. He was an escaped con from Soledad with a long rap sheet. And they decided very early on that they needed to do something to advance the revolution. They had no money and no recognition. The only thing they'd ever done was assassinate a very well-loved Oakland school superintendent, which immediately was denounced by the left. And they realized at that point that they needed to take a different direction. So in my interview with Bill Harris, who was one of the leaders of the group, a Vietnam vet, by the way, who had grown up in the college in the left and been involved in Vince Ramus, a leftist group, they decided that they needed to do something that would get them money and attention. And they came up with a perfect plan, which was, let's go for the daughter of one of the best known families in America, the Hearst, San Simeon. Legendary family, and we'll get $4 million and we'll get a lot of attention, and it'll be great because we'll be able to finance the revolution, basically. Not at all. In fact, I lived with her fiance after she was kidnapped. We wrote a book together. His name was Steve Weed, and he was, by the way, her high school math teacher at Crystal Springs School for Girls. And they began an affair when she was 16. So obviously, when she was kidnapped and he was badly beaten, his story became a primary resource for all journalists. And in our many months together, he made it very clear that Patty not only wasn't a leftist, but actually she easily walked through United Farm Worker picket lines, Cesar Chavez, and kind of cursed the migrants. And she wasn't at all involved in the women's movement. I lived in the Bay Area at the time, and I was working as a journalist and also as a author. And I began covering it for New Times Magazine and local newspapers, covered the trial. And of course, through a friend of my wife's, got to meet Steve, and we began working on this book together. And of course, that gave me a great deal of access because, of course, he had lived with the family during the ransom negotiations. So he had a lot of the blow-by-blow of what was going on with the family as they attempted to bring Patty home. Interestingly enough, although the story was one of the biggest news stories of the decade, it actually knocked the Watergate story off the front pages. There wasn't very much known about Patty. And what we learned as the case evolved was their history as a Hearst. She had been at odds with her parents on a number of things, including her marriage to Steve. They really had their doubts about that. They attempted to negotiate and failed. They didn't meet the $4 million ransom demand. They later went on to do a free food program. People around the country actually donated money to the cause. Patty was highly offended and very upset that they didn't free her. And obviously, the family had the money. She knew that. Everybody knew that. But there was a wild card in this, and that was that, unfortunately, because the Hearst family was so visible and so prominent, the fear was that by basically giving the money and going ahead and paying the ransom, that would incentivize the left, not just the SLA, to do similar acts. In fact, the Attorney General and our governor at the time, Ronald Reagan, both were against doing any kind of ransom. And as it turned out much later, their fears were not unfounded. There were actually, during her trial, when She was later arrested and went to trial in San Francisco. There was a bombing at San Simeon, and the bombing was a guest cottage, which, by the way, happened to be where the Hearst family went, even though the estate was owned by the California park system. They still had a cottage there that they could use, and that cottage was bombed during the Patty Hearst trial. So these fears were not unfounded. But of course, to Patty, fully realizing that this was $1 billion company currently valued at $21 billion, the money was not the question. It was really a matter of how they wanted to handle the larger question. Of course, that brought up an even bigger question, which was, okay, if they're not going to ransom her, who's going to protect her from a potential police assault? It was a complicated situation because the only people that were protecting her at that point were the SLA members, and they felt strongly that she had converted to their cause. Obviously, they did a lot of re-education sessions and so on, and she read a lot of books and so on. And through her communiques, we know that she, quote, fell in love with one of the kidnappers. She announced in a communique that she was no longer going to marry her fiance and that she'd fallen in love with Willie Wolf, one of the kidnappers. They gave her a gun because they felt that she had genuinely joined them. And in fact, she did participate in a bank robbery in San Francisco. So this was a pretty big switch, and it certainly changed the public perception of the story and put her family in a very difficult position. I think that the thing to understand about Patty was that she realized that in order to survive, she couldn't just walk away because there was always the possibility that anyone could go after her. And that could obviously be the authorities, but being a public figure now, I think she had a lot of concern about her personal safety. But I think more to the point, she felt strongly that her family had let her down at that time. In her own book that she wrote years after the kidnapping, she basically felt that Steve simply was taking the upper hand in their entire life, basically controlling her life, and she wanted basically a different life. She didn't want to be part of the family, or she didn't want to be part of Steve's life. She really wanted her independence. And remember, growing up as a Hearst, everything was given to her, so she never had any real challenges. But the minute she was with the SLA, she suddenly was living in poverty and obviously under great security and potential attack. So that changed her perception dramatically. Not only was it owned by the father of a close friend, Trish Tobin, but more to the point, Patty knew going in with a rifle that she was going to immediately become a worldwide celebrity at that point, because obviously in this moment, she went from being a victim of a captivity drama, this woman who had been taken, very dramatically by these kidnappers, and suddenly now she was becoming a criminal and part of a revolutionary movement. So picking that bank was a way of saying to the world, I understand the need for a revolution, and I want to begin by targeting people I know. She didn't just go after Bank of America. It was a very difficult decision to leave. Donald DeFries Cinque basically architected it, and they began living with people that he knew. He had spent a lot of time in LA, so he felt he had a community there. But very quickly, things began falling apart, particularly when Bill Harris, the kidnapper, his wife Emily, and Patty went on a shopping trip. And what happened there was Bill decided to shoplift, and Patty covered him with about 24 rounds when he was being tackled by security guards. So they had to abandon that van, and of course there was a parking ticket on the van, so when police recovered it, they found out where the SLA was. So while Patty and the Harrises were carjacking another vehicle. They basically went for a test drive with a 17-year-old high school student selling his parents' car named Tom Matthews. At that point, they were basically on the run, and the police were now tracking down the rest of the SLA in the safe house. And by the time they got to Anaheim, they went to basically a drive-in where they were going to meet the SLA. They assumed that would be their safe place to meet. They were waiting in a drive-in. When they didn't show up, they went to a motel in Anaheim and watched the SLA in the biggest firefight on American soil ever, 9,000 rounds on the safe house. And the safe house was incinerated, and 6 of the SLA members died, including Donald DeFreeze, Willie Wolf, and 4 of the women that had been part of the SLA. So it didn't work out very well in Los Angeles. At that point, began a 16-month cross-country journey, beginning with the Harrises, although for a good part of that time she was living on her own. They were in flight, and they became the subject of one of the largest manhunts in FBI history. It was called Operation Hernap, also called Her Snatch. And the FBI just had a terrible time tracking her down. She had the keys in the ignition. She could have put the gun down and driven off and turned herself in at that moment. But I think she felt safer with the Harrises than she did turning herself into the LAPD. And by the way, that firefight, one of the largest in the police department history, kind of confirmed her fears that turning herself in wasn't going to be all that easy, because now she was a wanted kidnapper and a bank robber. The kidnapping of Tom Matthews is one of the most fascinating parts of this story. Tom has been very extensively interviewed on this, and in her conversations with him, and she kind of befriended him, kind of trauma bonding, if you will. She made it very clear that she had a dream just before the kidnapping, a few days before, that she was going to be kidnapped. And she'd also made it clear in her own book that she felt a sense of liberation in a way, oddly enough, when she was kidnapped. And these sentiments basically relate to the fact that she had difficulty with both her family and, of course, with her fiance. In other words, that she was really having second thoughts. So I think that the carjacking of Tom Matthews was an act that they had to do because they really had no choice. They had nowhere else to go. They split up and they headed to Pennsylvania to a safe house. Jack Scott and his wife, Mickey, basically, he was a sports activist, and the two of them together provided a safe house in Pennsylvania. To get there, Patty posed as Jack's wife, and her parents rode with them all the way across the country to Pennsylvania, where they lived in the Poconos for that summer and did, weapons training and so forth. And then finally, people began to figure out what was going on. And at that point, they began the journey back, slowly back west. She was involved in scouting for a potential bank robbery in Marysville up north. And then eventually they decided to go after banks in Carmichael and Sacramento. And Patty was present for those events, although she wasn't the trigger person in those events. She was there involved in it. And then from there, they returned to San Francisco, where she was living with Wendy Yoshimura, who had become her kind of friend, and they were living independently of the Harrises. The consensus is that, given the magnitude of the FBI hunt, and of course what had happened in Los Angeles, that any attempt to turn herself in brought with it a certain amount of danger. But I think more to the point, she was living successfully on her own, and she had friends that were helping her out, and so forth, giving her money, and so forth. So she was more independent, and she wasn't under the pressure of either her family or the SLA. She didn't want to go back to Steve and get married. And as she put it pretty bluntly, where would I go when I came back? Patty was convicted of kidnapping in Los Angeles, bank robbery in San Francisco. She was sentenced to 7 years, and she served 21 months of that sentence in federal prison. And then her sentence was commuted by President Jimmy Carter, and she was later pardoned by Bill Clinton. She married her security guard, Bernard Shaw, and he was a former San Francisco policeman. And they raised a family in Connecticut. He became the head of her security. She went on to become a actress, working with John Waters, the Prince of Trash, as he calls himself. And she also wrote a novel. She wrote a book about her case. And that book was autographed. She autographed the paperback at San Simeon. She went to Cannes when the movie came out. And she's gone on to become a very successful dog breeder. Her dogs have won top prizes in many dog shows. So she's had basically a life, she's a mother, a grandmother, and she's gone on to, as much celebrity as she wants. In my book, Searching for Patty Hearst, we look pretty hard at that question. It depends on who you talk to. And from the point of view of the principals in the case, I think the debate is whether or not her recanting when she was arrested really reflects reality. I suspect the answer is that at the time that she committed those acts, she was acting out of belief in the rightness of the cause. However, in the hands of her lawyers and the celebrity attorneys that were handling her, the argument was that she in some way had been compromised or brainwashed. That argument did not work with either jury or either judge. And it's interesting when you look back on the case, it is pretty much of an unprecedented case. There's never really been anything like it. I was the first person to interview Bill Harris for a 3-part series for the Oakland Tribune. And he made it very clear that they were certain that the Hearsts were going to give them $4 million and they were going to be on their way, and they would be leading a revolution. And this would give them the notoriety that they needed to convince other people to take similar kinds of actions. When she converted, they were quite stunned, because at that point, they said, "You can walk right now." And she said, "I want to stay and fight." So that really caught them off guard. Obviously, they had the upper hand in the fact that the family wasn't ransoming her, which obviously she expected to happen. Who wouldn't in that situation? Even people that don't have their kind of resources, you would assume, would just go for it. And I think that the number one thing about Harris that's extremely important in this story, and I have it, the actual interview is in my book, is that Bill disputes the fact that in any way she was compromised. There's a big debate about that. And one of the things about the book is that we present all these different points of view so that the reader can decide by reading Searching for Patty Hearst who they want to believe. He's probably best known for the autopsies of Natalie Wood, Marilyn Monroe, Bobby Kennedy, of course. He hated the criticism of his office, which was very widespread. All these big cases, he was seriously attacked for various things, and he felt this was all very political. People trying to compromise the coroner's office, insurance companies getting involved, of course. They want a suicide ruling and he doesn't want to give it to them and so on. But he was just frantically upset with the LAPD. He was just mortified because essentially they wouldn't let him in right away. And this was just horrifying to him, to begin the process of what happened. And worse than that, in addition to shooting these victims, they touched off a fire, with tear gas grenades and so on. So their bodies are partially charred, and that was just a nightmare for him in terms of doing the autopsies. Obviously, he wanted to find out information like what kind of drugs were in their body and so on and so forth. But more to the point, he was a firm believer in psychological autopsies, and that got him into even more controversy because a lot of people didn't buy that approach to being a coroner. Basically, you go back over the life of the person to figure out what contributed to their demise. So you look at their behavior patterns and so on. Interestingly enough, when that attack happened, the LAPD did not know who was in that house. They only found out as the shootout progressed. So they didn't know if Patty was in there. And it was only after the bodies were all examined by Noguchi that they found out that Patty was still alive. Well, I think that probably in the context of the kind of insurrection and political violence that we're seeing in this country, I think a lot of what the SLA was talking about is relevant to the conversation that we're having today. And of course, the Me Too movement is very much a part of that discussion. And I think what is probably the single most important fact in the book and in this interview is that what reporters do, journalists do, what you do, what I do, and what historians do is we don't take anybody's word for it. When we do our job, we always cross-check everything. This isn't social media. This isn't tweets. This is, okay, you said that, now prove it. Or you go to somebody else who was in the same room at the same time and ask them, well, is that what really happened? Well, we have Bill Harris, who I interviewed, and Steve Weed, who I interviewed at great length because we wrote a book together that was never published. We have their side of the story. Now, when Patty trashes Steve and says, he was trying to dominate her life and tell her what to do, or, when she attacks Bill Harris, or even Jack Scott, who was directly responsible for getting her to safety. When she criticizes those people, it's interesting to hear their side of the story. And I think the reader needs to decide in their own mind what a historian or a journalist does is who do I want to believe? So I think that's really the lesson of the case and the book, which is you never, ever take any one person's word for anything. You always listen to all sides of the story. And that's something we really need to think about during our currently polarized times. I am convinced, looking at the criminal justice system of today, that someone who robbed a bank and kidnapped would probably be convicted. I'm not so sure about the sentencing, however, whether it would be suspended or not. But I think the overwhelming evidence in the case showed that at the time that Patty Hearst was involved in these criminal activities, she literally nobody was holding a gun to her head, forcing her to do it. And I want to make this very key point. When she came home, it's true that she recanted a lot of what she said in her communiques and her actions, but she did not recant her decision to leave Steve Weed. So that indicates that, in fact, some of what she was saying in these communiques was a belief that she still held after she was arrested. Okay. And I lived with Steve for many months. He was in my house. We worked on a book together. And I can tell you that decision, is understandable. And it indicates that for whatever changes of heart she had once she was arrested, it's very clear that some things she decided while she was working with SLA, she basically did not change her mind about that. So that kind of undercut her brainwashing argument that the lawyers were making. I think social media would have elevated this story in a negative way, negative to her. I think they really would have gone after her, and it would have been very damaging to her personally and to the family itself. I think the family would have really suffered because they really would have gone after the Hearst. I want to say something about the Hearst because I write for Hearst newspapers, I've written for Hearst magazines, I've worked for her cousin Will when he started the Outside magazine, so I know this organization pretty well. And I have to say, although historically the Hearst papers basically made a fortune on these damsel in distress kind of stories, that they were huge circulation builders, that the company today is a much different company. But at that time, it still had the Citizen Kane legacy. It was still portrayed, obviously, as a very conservative organization. And that was part of why they were attacked. But I think that the key thing about social media is they would have gone after the Hearst just nonstop. It would have been, and Patty herself, I think they would have just vilified her. Well, I think at this point, Patty's parents, got divorced after this all happened. Obviously, there was tremendous sympathy for Patty that fell apart when she got involved in these criminal actions. So I suspect today it wouldn't be a whole lot different than it was then. I think when Patty reads it, she's going to realize that I've made a serious effort to do what other authors haven't done, which is to give everybody, including people who've never had a voice, a chance to tell their side of the story. The book is very understanding of her changes that she went through and all the terrible nightmare that this was for her personally, and it basically gives a very credible explanation of what really might have happened. We'll never know the whole story, but why she changed her mind to join them, and then why she changed back, and what the influences were. I do think that this story will always be debated by all the experts. And the reason is that there's so much conflicting evidence. Obviously, there's been a lot of journalism and a lot of television and movies about this. And I don't think we're ever going to reach a point where everybody reaches a consensus on this. I think it's always going to be debatable. Yes, and I think the key thing that younger people who are new to the case need to understand is a lot of the things she was talking about were actually very, very credible issues in terms of women's rights, the homelessness, food insecurity, and so on. And she pinpointed a lot of things that needed attention. The fact that she hasn't really participated in those movements since the end of her incarceration, I think tells you that she doesn't really want to be a part of that story anymore. But I think for the rest of us, if you read her communiques, a lot of her complaints about the power structure being part of it are really, really important. And by the way, I think some of this did have an impact on the family and the corporation. Her father, for example, was very involved in making sure that in some of the schools in the area that didn't have the advantages of a private school, that there was money available for computer systems and other perks that the private schools had that the public schools didn't. And in fact, she kind of put her father down for some of his interest in this when she was talking to Steve. This was before she was kidnapped. She thought it was kind of a waste of time, so to speak, and she made that very clear to Steve. One of the interesting things that I want to share with you about my collaboration with Steve is that, in their time together, he had been her math teacher, and they began an affair when she was a 16-year-old junior at his high school. He had flunked her sister in math, so they had a kind of an interesting friendship. But as time evolved, she was having trouble with math. He built her a project out of balsa wood for her geometry class. And then at one point, he actually stole an exam that was the final for the geometry class that was used every year and gave it to her and spent 3 hours tutoring her on the right answers to this final. And she only got an 80%. So they were living a pretty interesting life. You've asked a really good question, is who do we believe in this story? I think the advantage of historical fiction is that you get everybody basically agreeing on a certain set of facts. Obviously, she was kidnapped at a bank robbery, kidnapping herself, and so on. You get all that information. But when you try to get into basically what people were motivated, how they were feeling, what their attitudes were, it's very difficult to do that in a journalistic framework. So the advantage of historical fiction is that you get to meet everybody and they get a chance to tell what they saw and thought and felt. And you understand that there were a lot of conflicting motivations, which led to a lot of confusion at the time and a lot of mistakes that were made. Obviously, the biggest single mistake in this story was the failure of the family to ransom her when they had the money to do it. And explaining that is, I think, at the heart of the story. It's very, very difficult to do that journalistically. In fact, it's really impossible. But in fiction, you can make a convincing case that's plausible. And I think that's the kind of thinking that we need to do to understand why people make disastrous mistakes in their life. And hopefully those insights will help people when they're evaluating themselves. Obviously, in the moment, with the National Press Corps camped out on their front lawn, they couldn't walk out of the house, without CBS, or NBC shooting an interview in the moment, and with the Attorney General attacking them for giving away food to the homeless, and saying you shouldn't give them any help, and Ronald Reagan saying, "I hope the people that got this food from the Hearst come down with botulism." They were really, really in a tough spot. The answer to that is no, she would not have been commuted if she hadn't been Hearst. I don't believe that. Everybody, one way or another, is impacted by some of these large corporations that dominate the media landscape. We all are impacted. As I say, I've written for the Hearst papers and really enjoyed doing that. And I have friends that are in the Hearst organization. They're close personal friends. There's a lot of wonderful people. And I subscribe to Hearst publications. But the reality is that I think for all of us, we need to understand that even these organizations themselves are vulnerable in some ways. And that means that on a personal level, they're pretty much like the rest of us. And it's not all that easy to navigate these troubled times that we're in. And I think that's what happened to the Hearst. They just got caught in the middle of a political nightmare. Well, Steve basically signed a contract with me for a book with Ballantine Books for a very substantial advance on the promise that we would tell the truth and not leave anything out. And he got a little nervous as we got closer and closer, began rewriting the book, and decided that he wanted to take out, he was a drug dealer at Princeton. Obviously he had an affair with her when she was a student in high school. I mean, these were pretty controversial subjects. And I think he wanted to tone it down somewhat. That was his decision. So ultimately, the collaboration fell apart, and I got to write this book, which is not from one person's point of view. And from my own perspective, I think it's a much better book. I think it was good that he went off and told his story the way he wanted to tell it. And we settled. And I'm glad he did his book, and I'm happy that I had an opportunity to do a much broader book based on many years of further research. I mean, this has been going on for 50 years. There wasn't anything he did right. Patty became a witness against the Harrises and so on. He got nothing back for that. When you give the prosecutor some help on another case, you expect to get some consideration, but he didn't even negotiate it. His closing testimony, he basically sounded like he was on drugs or drunk. He was flying to Las Vegas in the afternoons when this trial was going on to run another case. And the entire argument that she had in some way been brainwashed just fell on deaf ears. It absolutely didn't work. It was one of his worst performances, and the only big case F. Lee Bailey ever lost. That's a very good question. I think the answer is that I have talked to people that I knew. Don Fried is one of them, who was a private investigator, and they worked in the intelligence, with people basically who defected from the intelligence community. And of course, when I was with Steve, he was talking to the FBI a lot. They were doing a lot of interviews. But I think their wider perspective on this is that DeFreeze was a police informant. So there's a lot of speculation about his motivation. Was he setting anybody up? Was this all part of a criminal conspiracy on the part of the intelligence agencies and so forth to kind of make the left look bad? But my perspective on this is that, yes, they made a lot of terrible mistakes, and they did make the left look terrible, clearly. But they were so disorganized that it wasn't like anybody was running them. It just doesn't seem possible. They made so many mistakes and obviously got killed in the process. So I think they were aware of what was going on, but I don't think they were directing any of the traffic, so to speak. There's one other question about, if Patty had been a minority and didn't have a lot of resources, would in a comparable case, would there have been a pardon and a commutation? I think the answer to that is no. There's no question that the family and the company did an incredible job. They even got Cesar Chavez, after she had walked through his picket lines, to basically write a letter to Jimmy Carter endorsing commutation. So no, I don't think that someone who didn't have her family's clout, would have been commuted, and they would have served a full sentence. And by the way, an interesting footnote: Patty's a dog lover, and her husband, Bernard Shaw, got some guard dogs after they began living together. And the attack command for these guard dogs was Oric. And Oric was the name of the judge who sentenced her.